Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for returning. For those of you that are returning to chew on this, my name is Matt Donato. I'm a partner here with Echelon Risk and Cyber. As always, accompanied by my fearless crime fighter, Mr. Paul Interval. Hello, Paul.
Hey, Matt. Good to be here.
Good to see your nod. Thank you for that. That's a start. Yeah, we're excited to have everybody back for this lunch edition here. Those of you that are on the East Coast, thank you for joining us during your lunch hour. Those of you on the West Coast, hopefully you've had at least a cup of coffee or two to get your day going. And those of you that are overseas, if we're fortunate enough to have you with us, whatever time of day it is, thank you for joining. Again, this is Chew on This. I would like to, before we make a quick introduction to our guest, I want to quickly thank the folks that support this initiative. Chew on This was founded with the vision of trying to discuss more strategically the convergence of cybersecurity with the business. Lots of talk tracks, lots of discussions are talked about more technical orientations in cybersecurity and less around the business side, the business risks. So today we're welcoming Greg Notch, the CISO from Expel. He's going to give us his insight and wisdom on some of his experiences as it relates to the specific topic that we have today. So hello, Greg. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Our pleasure. Just before we jump into the professional bio, favorite lunch topic or favorite lunch that you prefer to have if you're away, not here today, what would you be eating? And share us your favorite food of choice.
I think I like a good lunch taco. A good taco is nice for lunch.
Nice. Are we talking chicken? Are we talking beef? Talking lamb?
I think I'm like an al pastor guy, or if I'm in the South somewhere, if you get a good like fried fish taco, like those are nice too. Off a truck, whatever you got.
Off a truck. Well, that sounds good. Well, you two are in the audience are the ones keeping me between my lunch. So I will. We're going to move on from the food discussions and move into the main menu. So of the broader course that we have for today, the specific topic that we're going to be talking about is focusing on expertise as it relates to security business solutions. Greg, you have an interesting background. If you would just give everyone a little bit of an understanding as to who you are, kind of where you are now with Expel, what you've done in previous years, and then we can segue kind of into the three main topics that we have.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Greg. I'm the CISO for Expel. Expel's a managed detection and response provider. It means we provide security services to companies who have security technologies. I've been here for about 2 years. I manage our internal security program and a bunch of other stuff. Prior to that, I spent about 15 years at the National Hockey League doing their security program and a bunch of other like infrastructure related work. And, I've done basically tech for 25 plus years now.
Excellent. Do you have a particular, now you're on the record, so you don't have to answer this. You can decline to respond. Any preferred NHL team, or do you just like them all?
Well, now that I don't work there anymore, I can say I have two. I like the Flyers for their grit, and I like Toronto for their stick handling and the way the finesse play.
You like Toronto for their remarkable losing history in playoffs. Wonderful.
Yeah, they haven't won since TV has been color. Actually,
yeah.
I'm not even
sure if I remember those days. As a Boston Bruins fan, we're so accustomed to taking your lunch money before we even reach the playoffs, and it's so enjoyable. Now, I'll save the banter for another time, but that's great. I wanted to get your insight of that. I'm sure over time you probably saw a pretty dramatic increase of just improvement to the organization's posture. What made you move to Expel? What was that transition? I'm curious.
Sure. So I, as a part of the work I did for the league, I advised a bunch of venture capital firms. And one of the problems I was trying to solve was not building a SOC internally at the NHL. I didn't want to staff that. It's an expensive proposition. And at the time, there weren't any really good ways to outsource that, to externalize that from your internal operations. And so I was talking to VCs about how to do that. And, at the time they were like, well, it's not really a venture backable business, but eventually the founders of Expel and I got put together. They started the company, and then 6 years later I joined. So it's an interesting, confluence of events, but I was looking for this to take this type of operation off of the books because it's not really a hockey related thing. So maybe that helps tee up some of the conversations we're going to have.
That's a perfect segue. And once again, Mr. Interval is giving me the go ahead nod, Matt. Land the plane and move on. Well, perfect. So, what are the main reason? Well, number one, we're grateful to have you here. We love our partnership with Expel. You guys are doing some wonderful things. There's my one and only cheesy sales plug for the day. Shameless plug for you guys, but
well, thank you, because I'm
you
the
all.
hero. So that is perfect.
And as we were preparing for this, I clearly called out, let's leave the plugs alone. But here I am making one in the first 5 minutes. But looking at cybersecurity investment strategies for diverse portfolios, this series is going to delve more specifically into that topic, what that's all about. Obviously, the M&A life cycle from a business standpoint entails a lot of different decision making, lots of due diligence that needs to be done prior to an acquisition, and of course, once the deal is done. And then there's the integration of said acquisition, or even a divestiture for that matter. So we're going to discuss kind of the due diligence life cycle, if you will, but through the lens of risk and cybersecurity. And we're going to kind of chop this up into 3 chapters, and we will do our best to get through it. Certainly, if you are listening or participating in the webinar, feel free to put any comments or chat in there. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout. Our good team here at Echelon will be keeping us honest and will allow us to come up for air if we need to, but I would encourage you to be as interactive as you can. So tell us kind of a little bit about, obviously, as cybersecurity is more and more of a topic of concern for private equity firms, understanding what you're purchasing from a security standpoint, what kind of risk you're incurring when you do make an acquisition. What leads up to that acquisition stage, and why is cybersecurity such an important element in that certain phase of the acquisition?
I mean, the primary thing I would imagine is you want to price the risk into your purchase price. And I think if you're using DCF or some other model for pricing whatever you're gonna buy, you got to think about, like, well, how much of the investment in cybersecurity has already been made? What additional investment should be made, perhaps? And I guess the gap between those two things is, sort of, inherent risk in the purchase, and should be priced into the acquisition, just like, financial risk, debt risk, externalized, the cost of capital, any of the other things that go into, the pre-acquisition, risk, analysis pre-purchase.
Excellent. And a good answer. And a couple of things that you touched on. I imagine there's probably economies of scale. There's probably a standardized approach. I can tell you from the consulting side of things, as a cybersecurity firm, this is becoming more and more of a point of emphasis. Not dealing with it post-mortem, post-acquisition of, geez, this is actually what we have now, and we've got some inherent risk because of this. We have some significant investments that we need to make, or we need to change the way our infrastructure is set up. So it's a big point of emphasis up front. A lot of money is being spent, as it probably should be, up front, just to have a better understanding as to what you're acquiring. Paul, as someone who leads a virtual CISO team, obviously we support a number of VC and private equity backed companies, but also companies that are not private equity backed, but also have a portfolio approach with several different business units and entities. What do you see, again, in the modality of pre-acquisition? What do you see as table stakes for those organizations? What things are organizations doing well? Maybe they could improve upon. What are a couple of things that you think of and observe in your day to day?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about taking, a very methodical and consistent approach. Certainly if this is a company that is, making, frequent or often, acquisitions, I think that you need to follow, as I said, a methodical kind of approach where you're really looking at the whole bigger picture. I think sometimes companies don't do themselves a justice by only scratching the surface and, really not kind of going deep enough to understand, the full potential risks, that are in play. Certain things like having a full understanding of that company's regulatory requirements, understanding the type of data that's out there, in the company. I think that's a huge can of worms, right? Like once you start kind of looking into that, I think inevitably companies find that there's data sprawl, right? There's probably old, stale data that may not need to be there. And specifically thinking about sensitive data, protecting the company's assets and data as part of the acquisition is absolutely critical, and ensuring that you understand the full scope of that, and how it applies to, like I said, potential regulatory requirements.
So yeah, completely agree. Makes sense. And Greg, kind of a question for you and Paul. What are some things organizations, private equity, VC, publicly traded, non-publicly traded companies with multiple different entities, when they're approaching the due diligence phase and assessing whether or not this is a viable acquisition? Of course, unfortunately, in utopia would be, cybersecurity would be one of the main decision-making factors that they have. Unfortunately, as I talk to a lot of my friends in the PE community, cybersecurity they have 4 weeks basically to do some due diligence before the acquisition is made. And so the probability of that deal not going through is pretty low. But what can an organization do to assess, tech debt, the data that they have, the protection that they have, the maturity of their organization? What are some table stakes that they could do to quickly assess that?
I think if you asked me to do it, the first thing I would ask is look at their existing compliance regimes. I would like, hey, you have these certifications. Cool. What were the scope of those certifications, right? Like, because you can play some games with scope. So like, just what are your activities and how are you measuring them already? I'd look for some key table stakes things like, do you have MFA enabled everywhere? Do you have do you have reasonable policies? There's just some like very core, like if you don't have like an endpoint protection product in place, like there's just some very basic things that will make it hard to understand the security of your environment. And then I would do that as quickly as possible, right? Like that should be like a few hours. Sure. Where I'd want to spend my time is sort of what Paul was talking about, which is the stuff that's closer to the business. I characterize everything else on what I was talking about before as like table stakes, and like then there's all right, how does your business make money? How's the data that's aligned with your business making money? Like, what are the risks associated with that part? Like the stuff that's closer to it, because that's what you're going to want to spend your time understanding. Are they exercising due care? Like, what's the gap between where it is and where we want it to be, and what risk does that present? That's how I would approach it.
Yeah, and are we looking for a specific roadmap per se? Are we looking for kind of an overview of people, processes, and technology? Are we looking at all the above? Or we mentioned some table stakes, but strategically speaking, is there a demarcation to where you might see an organization backing out of a deal because of an assessment that is done? And what are some things that they would be finding as a result of that would probably maybe alter the course of this decision-making process?
I mean, an undisclosed data breach would be one, right? As you start to do due diligence, that's probably not a good look. Any sort of consent decrees or other like extant like problems with regulators or ongoing lawsuits or anything like that would come up as part of legal or like financial due diligence. As far as like this. You're looking for a quick hit on the basics, and then things that I would look for is like uncontrolled access, like to huge piles of sensitive information. Like, hey, there's a database over here with all of our customers, and everyone has access to it. Like, just some real like you didn't put any thought into your cyber posture, and you're one click away from it being disastrous. I would counter that with, well, some of these things are actually pretty easy and not that expensive to fix. So you just call them as like, hey, these are risks. You're going to fix this like day one because we can reduce the risk profile of this company pretty easily. And that sort of depends on who the acquirer is, right? If it's an acquisitive, I'd say a strategic, right, that has a bunch of other portcos that they have a program that they can apply consistently across, acquisitions, like that's an easier thing and less expensive thing than like, oh, you're a PE company that's like, or PE that's like folding in a company that you're going to spit out in a couple of years, like where you're not going to bring in some centralized services necessarily to that program. Sure.
Yeah, and a good transition to Paul. Are we seeing companies with a very common theme, good, bad, or indifferent, went through the due diligence and integration process? Are we noticing that? Yeah, they don't really know what good looks like. Are we seeing a decent baseline? Are we seeing companies with decent processes that could use an overhaul, but maybe some okay technology? Like, what's the overall experience that you've had from where you sat?
Yeah, I mean, I would say people certainly try, to take an organized approach, but I do think that there's a lot of room for improvement there. I don't think people spend enough time sort of coming up with the plan before they're already sort of waist deep in a potential acquisition, right? And sometimes it moves pretty quickly, which is just part of the game. But I think having something set up beforehand, before you kind of get into these types of activities, like leveraging industry standard best practices. Sometimes you talk about NIST and some of these very common but also very robust frameworks. I think people tend to get a little paralyzed by the sort of overwhelming amount of controls and things that you can get lost in. And so, really kind of reiterating what Greg said, you want to find your kind of, key heavy hitter items, right? Like MFA and certain things. Have they done a pen test ever before? Like, get your hands on as much information that you can, where you're going to find some critical and high level types of risks or vulnerabilities or weaknesses within the organization. And then what we've been doing is trying to help companies almost develop sort of a hybrid approach where you take the best of all breeds. You leverage frameworks, but then you also take a look at, from more of a business perspective, what are the things we really care about? What are the things that we need to focus on? So you can create some efficiencies in that process. And then, once you have that plan in place that you feel like you could go to war with, it serves a bunch of purposes. Obviously, it helps you speed up the process, but it also makes future acquisitions and other acquisitions that you may be doing stay consistent. So you have kind of this more of a consistent continuity of assessing the risks and comparing one against the next, instead of doing plan A over here, plan B over there. And I see that a lot where there's inconsistencies with the approach.
Yeah, anything to build on that, Craig?
Yeah, sure. I would just caveat that, so NIST, like 853, you're totally right. Like, that's like 300 something controls to like benchmark someone against. I will call out that like the NIST CSF, which is a much lighter touch and smaller framework, is actually something you can bang out in a weekend if you have the right folks helping you out. And that can give you, especially the new version of it, that can give you some pretty good, quick. But the new version of it basically has governance in it. So like, how mature are you at each of the things that are in there? That can actually give you a pretty good like thumbnail sketch of an average security program, presuming you have the folks who can actually execute one and get the answers. I just don't think like auditing is doable in most due diligence timelines. So you kind of got to go with what paper you can find on the ground, kind of. Exactly. And that is, so you're not going to hold up the deal, right? So you just want to make sure you put some sort of risk assessment in front of the folks and be like, look, this could cost you X with Y probability if this happens, right? Like, that's if you ask a CFO, like, tell me what, like how much money did I spend to reduce risk by Y amount for over time, right? Like, that's the answer they really want. It's very hard to do, but at least if you can give them a ballpark answer on that, I think the CSF will help you. 853 too big, so I think that would be
way too big. Yeah, quantifying the risk in general, trying to understand balance sheet implications would be very helpful. And I imagine anyone in a private equity or VC community is probably going to welcome that. That's going to be kind of more important things probably for them to consider is how much money are we going to be out should something happen if we do make this acquisition. What does bad look like, and so on.
There's two things. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
Two things that Paul mentioned that are actually pretty interesting. So when he's talking about getting pen test reports, one thing you could look at is like, well, how quickly did they fix it? If you have a vulnerability management scorecard or whatever, like or vulnerabilities, you're like, oh, that's interesting, fine. Like, how quickly did they remediate it? Because that's actually a fairly strong, like, positive indicator that they have an aggressive approach to cybersecurity. Whereas if you get two pen tests in a row with the same two vulnerabilities on it, and no treatment plan, like that tells you a bit about the priority of cybersecurity within that org,
the culture,
which may be fine, right? Which may be fine, but at least it's like a secret lens for like, how are you operating your program?
Yeah, it's good data to understand kind of what you're buying, not only from a technology perspective, but from a culture perspective, and that kind of segues nicely to looking at the kind of post-acquisition integration process? Are we bullish on taking a centralized approach to all portcos? Are we bullish on leveraging technologies and synergies of processes across all the entire portfolios? What's kind of your take on that? Not that that is a take per se, but I'm sure it's not a one size shoe fits all. But let's kind of get some more texture to what centralization could do and how we could leverage that type of approach versus keeping things completely decentralized.
I mean, like everyone's favorite answer, it depends, right? Yeah, I can speak for some companies that I've worked with and for where federated models where you centralized like a bunch of the cost, like you get high economic leverage out of doing that. But I would say I wouldn't do it if you plan to flip a company out after 2 years, right? Like if it's an operating model where you're going to operate the subsidiaries for an extended period of time, the unit economics of a cybersecurity program get much better the bigger you are.
Sure.
But that doesn't help you if in the end you're gonna flip them out without a cybersecurity program, and they're gonna have to build it as well. So a good example is a sports league, right? Sports leagues have teams. Each team's funded in a certain way. Like their ability as a team to build a cybersecurity program is much weaker because you can't fund it at the same level as you can centrally fund it at the league office. And if you pool your resources, you can build a pretty world-class security program at a sports league for 40 plus organizations. And so leaving sports aside, I've seen that, and we have customers now that have this sort of model. If you can think of like, franchise food service or, any sort of like manufacturing concerns that have subsidiaries and supply chains, like people do that and they find great unit economics in doing so. But I think it really depends on what, like from an investment point of view, what your investment horizon is and your view on how operational you want to be in one of your portcos.
Yeah, that's a great example. I was thinking of that in my head. I was wondering how similar or dissimilar it was coming from the NHL. Is it a very decentralized approach or is it very centralized? I imagine with all those different owners, those owners don't just own those professional sports teams. They own other entities, other businesses. They probably roll that under a different type of business structure. And so where does the line draw in the sand? How much can an organization like the NHL, I guess, what could they expect and standardize? What kind of standards do they have in place across the
I have a great example from that. Yeah. So there was one team whose parent organization ran a really, really large international retail establishment as well. So they had a security program that was much better funded than the one that the league had. I mean, they had like an internal 12-person pen testing team. Like that is not something that, that's a fairly substantial and fairly mature security program. And so it was one of those moments where, you go meet their security leader and you realize like, okay, I'm not bringing anything to the table in this conversation. It's it almost flips where you're like, oh, well, like, how can we help each other? Because you actually have resources that we don't have. And how do we bring that to the rest of the club? So there are some interesting nuances that like what you're saying is like all of a sudden you walk into a room where they're like highly sophisticated retail or highly sophisticated financial services operations have, incredibly mature programs that are different than what you might have at a sports league.
Yeah, Paul, we've worked with a couple of the three-letter professional sports organizations across the world, and you've seen some things, some positives and some areas for improvement. Kind of looking at this centralized approach versus decentralized approach, kind of stay in that theme for the moment. What do you believe is the top priority for an organization to be able to say, look, we want to leave you autonomous, but yet we still expect certain things to be done? And how would you approach that? What are the three things that you would expect for that decentralized portfolio company, whether it be a business unit, a franchise, et cetera? What would you expect for them to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, there's a lot of variables at play, and I don't think you can have necessarily just one kind of cookie cutter approach, right? So I think you need to, depending on the types of acquisitions or the types of companies that are in your portfolio structure, I think there's ways to leverage efficiencies and centralized services, and maybe if it's not all, it could be a hybrid approach. and I've seen that as well. So I think it's a matter of, trying to leverage as much as you can, for economies of scale, but also for, consistency across the organizations, right? Like, I think it's really important that, let's just go down the example of a company that is operating independently. I think there's still some level of, onus and responsibility, right? Of course, of the parent company to, keep the line of communication very strong there, and ensure that, one, they're supporting them, but two, they're also ensuring that, they're meeting whatever the parent company's minimum best practices are. You hope that they're exceeding those, right? And so I think the best thing that you can do is go in with kind of a few different options, and find the best fit in that particular operating model. And then you do whatever you can to support it and ensure that, look, we're not leaving anything out there that's unaddressed, right? So, in a situation where, like a holding company that has a number of different companies, and in some cases that company may be leveraging all of the parent company's services, and in other cases maybe it's a hybrid or fully independent. I think one thing that you can do is implement.
Oh, I think we lost his audio. Greg, did we lose his audio, or is that?
Yeah,
I
can't hear him.
Yeah,
Hey,
Paul, we lost your audio. We'll let you get that right. I think he's still rolling. We're gonna let him. We're gonna do the dub over for him. That's interesting. It's kind of an interesting disruption, because I was curious, from the Expel lens and the MDR world, making that transition. Are you seeing more and more companies try to leverage an MDR solution across, multiple different business entities? Is it still very fragmented? And second part, that question is, as a CISO, what are you advising the customer base to do in terms of how to get maximum value from EDR, XDR, MDR? What are some things that you're constantly in conversation and addressing with your customer base?
Sure. I mean, I guess from just a pure business hat and not talking my book perspective, like, right, the unit economics are like much better for most businesses to not try to build some of the functions that an MDR provides. Like, you have to be a pretty large company with a pretty sophisticated set of security problems to want to build detection engineering internally. Right. And like, it's just an expensive thing to do. And so you should look to, like, my personal view on security is you should outsource the things that aren't close to your business. And you should attempt to get that down so that it is a standard of care that meets an economic model that makes sense to your business. And then you should turn to the things that are like super close to your business and, that are maybe unique to your business. Like, you run a casino, you have a whole different threat model than if you run a restaurant versus a, financial services business. Sure. And so you focus on the things that make your business unique and that you care about deeply, and sort of the more table stake things like, do you have things on an endpoint, and are you monitoring that? And are you monitoring your cloud infrastructure or whatever other, sort of core network infrastructures that you have? Like, that part, you don't probably want to figure out how to minimize your spend on that, because if you're looking at your security dollars, you want to spend as many of those dollars on the things that you care about the most. And you, like, keeping the flotsam and jetsam and worrying about ransomware from commodity like players is probably not something you want to spend your time on. You want to be more concerned about the things that are going to impact, particularly like operational like security problems. Like, hey, is this going to disrupt my business? Can I keep bringing the cash if this thing is going like that? Yeah. That sort of stuff.
Yeah, the continuity is one thing, and then there's the impact financially that could have should operations be disrupted. That's time is money, as they say, and certainly some businesses it could be a quick way to meet your demise within short order. So makes complete sense. And kind of in the field, as you're talking to customers, as you not only represent the MDR community, but just kind of looking at bleeding edge technologies and solutions that are out there. This is kind of a tangential question, but bear with me. Do you observe any significant gaps in terms of coverage from a detection and response standpoint? And what are organizations like Expel doing to solve for that?
Interesting. So I would say by the time you're ready for somebody like Expel, by the time you're ready for an MDR, you sort of have to be this tall to ride this ride. Like you have to have some
Right.
more security technologies in place, because otherwise an MDR doesn't make sense for you. If you don't have some basic cloud detection and an EDR in place that of your choice, whether you buy your MDR from your EDR provider, or you buy it from somebody like us, like you kind of have to have some basic level of security, maturity in order to do it. So I'd say we don't talk to a lot of folks who don't have that level of maturity. If when we do, we say, look, we'd like to help you, get to be this tall. And so that's usually how those conversations go. As far as like advances in detection engineering go, right? Like this is like literally where the cat and mouse game happens. It's like, novel attack, new detection, like, new data source, new type of attack, whether it's identity or network or cloud or Kubernetes or endpoint, like those are like, that's the front lines of it. And so what I would say is if you don't have the capabilities or want to build and fund the capabilities to be in that game, you should find a way to externalize that from your balance sheet and get that and get the, you want detection engineering for people who deeply understand your applications, but you don't want like somebody who's like, well, can this piece of commodity malware, cause a ransomware event in my network? That kind of thing.
Yeah. So do you think sometimes organizations take their eye off the ball or have a tough time prioritizing what's most important? In that regard, the context.
I think it's hard because a lot of CISOs don't speak the same language as CFOs. And so when they're thinking about like, CFO is thinking, well, how much, like relative to how much money I'm investing, what return am I getting on that in terms of risk reduction? And it's very difficult. It requires a lot of cybersecurity maturity to be able to answer that question. And so you have to be even taller to ride that ride. And so it's very difficult to give the business answers that like business and finance executives need from a cyber program. So I think you have a problem there. As far as the like taking the eye off the ball, I think it's hard to understand the priorities when you don't put them in terms of dollars and cents. Like how much damage could missing this thing do to my business? If I don't know the answer to that question, it looks like I'm just chasing risk or I'm chasing
just guessing.
Yeah,
just guessing in general. So obviously, assessing risk is a broader theme, but more importantly, understanding the impact financially that something could happen, disrupt the business. What does that look like? How are you measuring that? I'm sure that kind of opens up a broader can of worms. Paul, welcome back. By the way, I know you had some technical issues, and looks like you've got them sorted out.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me okay. My headset decided to stop working on me, which is great.
Technology at its finest. Well, if COVID taught us anything, it was how to work in a remote environment and just kind of roll with things, whether it be kids walking in the camera, dogs barking in the background, and other distractions. So no worries at all. Well, just kind of moving into the final segment here. We've talked about pre-acquisition. We've talked about the integration phase of a deal, looking at the broader cybersecurity strategy and how to get the maximum value from making an investment. Are there kind of some 2 or 3 things that you'd like to leave the audience with that you think are going to be very important for people to know, whether they're in the investment world or not, whether their company is acquisitive or not? Maybe they're looking to divest a piece of their business. Is it provide some guidance or some advice to those different types of audience of here are the 2 things that you should consider doing in the near term, even if you're not in that type of modality? What are those 2 things? And Paul, I'll start with you since you were out for 5 minutes and Greg and I started talking about the weather. 2 or 3 things per scenario. So investment firm, organizations in the investment community, organizations that may not be, but may be acquisitive, and then organizations that may want to position themselves for an exit at some point. What are 2 things that you advise all 3 of those types of scenarios?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'll start with is just, having some type of program to properly assess the current state of the cybersecurity program, right? So, I think a lot of times these companies, they go through a very heavy lift, right? Through due diligence, acquisition, and integration. And then, you sort of just, it gets pushed to the back burner as priorities shift and people, change attention to other things. And I think it's really important that you continue to have, somewhat of, the foot on the gas, right? Like you don't want to completely just let, sleeping dogs lie, like, and just assume that everything is kind of, moving in the right direction, that the things that were identified were remediated appropriately, or that the things that were fine, upon integration are still fine today. So I think it's really important that you do have an organized structure where, you're doing check-ins, you're assessing, where is the current state of the program today, so that you have a barometer of, where do all things stand. And that way, at any given moment, you really should be able to understand, what level of risk are you faced with, how much, continued either tech debt or, looking at your cybersecurity roadmap, how many things are still out there that left to be, addressed, and how much of, cost is out there where you still need to sink additional investment to, to get these companies up to the state where you feel like they're on stable ground and potentially ready for either, like you said, divestiture or maybe, selling off or, spinning off to another company. But I think the key point there is understanding the current state of the environment, having a way to best quantify, the level of, additional cost or things you need to be concerned with if you were looking to spin that company off.
Yeah, so that's probably something that a statement you could say that could be, I guess, federated across any type of business or industry. Greg, anything to build on? Again, just kind of in the mode of takeaways for.
Sure. As an acquirer, like, get a quick grip on the basics, and then deep dive into the specifics that are close to your business if you're an acquirer, right? Like look for audits, look for compliance frameworks, look for control gaps. In the middle, I would say look at the sort of more secret squirrel views of, like, do you have a vulnerability management program, and how are you doing, like, operationally, your cadence, like, how are you doing it? Fixing vulnerabilities, remediating pen test findings, OFIs from your audits or whatever. Like that cycle, like, ask for that documentation. For operating, I would look at two things. If you're, like, operating a subsidiary, it's like two things. Is one, like a roadmap, like Paul's been saying, is like, let me see your trajectory. I think in today's world, you've got to look at driving efficiency and leverage out of a cybersecurity program, whether that means optimizing what's in place or using your the operating leverage you have as an acquirer to drive that efficiency in there. And then if you want to be sold, I think you talked about these, like, if you're making sure that you have this package of information presented in a way, not just that other cyber people can understand, but but financial people can understand. I'm sure if you rolled up with, like, listen, we did a FAIR model, and here's our inherent risk, and here's our risk treatment plan in dollars, and here we can show our receipts. Like, I'm sure that will grease the skids incredibly, because effectively the buyer can say, like, look, these guys have it handled. There's people doing the cyber due diligence can look at that and be like, yep. And then they're no longer part of the investment pipeline or the investment decision-making pipeline. So if you can't do that, I would say make sure you at least have the receipts for what your program is doing, like the operational components of it, and then your plan for risk reduction, and even expose a little bit of this is what we know are the problems, because you're more credible if you're like, yeah, everything's fine. Like, almost no one believes that. So
transparency has to be an integral part of that process, for sure. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, it's not just the transparency, though. It's showing that it's a problem, right? Like, it's like, yes, I'm admitting to it, but it's also like, yeah, no, I know that thing isn't great, and it's going to require this investment and this time to fix. We can talk about our timeline to do it, but it's more that you're cognizant of it, as well as being transparent about it.
Yeah, excellent. And do you think, Greg, a question for both you and Paul, Greg, do you feel this is going to become more and more of an important integral part of the acquisition process? Is cybersecurity will be toward the top of the list of things that need to be considered? Or do we think this is going to be its own little business ecosystem in and of itself?
I'm of two minds. It depends. So I think it should be right, because it's really like, I go back to, if you're buying a business on DCF or some other financial model, like, you have to know what the discount is. And so cyber risk is a discount, just like any other business risk, litigation, regulatory, or whatever, right? So you have to know that, and the risks are big for some of these companies. So there's that, but there's also cyber due diligence isn't that mature yet. And so you can't get a high fidelity answer to the question. So at some point you just price in some basic risk and move on. Depends on the deal, right? Very large acquisition with complicated technology, maybe you lean in a little more. Like, you're buying something where it's a kind of a well understood business, and you're like, all right, I can understand what the operational risk is. Maybe not. So I'd say it depends on the type.
Yeah, it's a tough question because we're speaking so broadly that depends on a variety of different elements in the industry, a number of different things. Paul, any final words on that specific topic before we bring this thing to a close?
Yeah, I mean, I think just reiterating that, it isn't quite that mature yet. I think in the industry, there's a lot left to be developed. I mean, we're seeing it even, constant conversations around cyber insurance, right? And just the difficulty that they have with quantifying, the level of risk, within an organization. I mean, it's the same essentially, right? So, we've even said in our past, webinars that there are some tools and some, programs out there that are being developed and are increasingly getting better to help you assess the risk from a quantifiable standpoint. So I do think that we'll see continued improvements there, over the next several years. And I think for now, the best thing you can do is go in with a very comprehensive plan. Certainly ignoring it's not the approach, right? Full transparency, like Greg said, point out the things that you're aware of, do the best you can to price that all in. And just make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page, until these things mature a little bit further.
Yeah, that's well put. And a great place to conclude. Well, I want to thank you, Greg, for joining us today. Great addition to the discussion here. Thank you, as always, Paul, for co-hosting with me. And if people have any follow-up questions, they can certainly reach out to us offline. But this will bring us to our conclusion of our fourth course here at Echelon Risk and Cyber, and we appreciate you guys joining Chew on this. See you next time.
Awesome. Thank you.
See you guys.